Hello, everyone. I hope you're safe and well. My name is Aya Shebi. I am the African Union Youth Envoy. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to another virtual African Union Youth consultations on COVID-19 for a collective youth response. As part of my role, as you know, as bringing closer the African youth to the African Union, every Wednesday we host a special guest. 2 p.m. Addis Ababa time, we host a decision maker that you engage with directly and you ask your questions live. This week we have a very special guest, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the AU Special Envoy on COVID-19. Dr. Ngozi was recently appointed by the Chair of the Assembly, President of South Africa. Young people, I know you have so many questions on our topic today, youth and employment, economic recovery, and much more. So if you want to ask a question, just go down to the bottom of your page where it says Q&A and click on the Ask Question tab on the top right. Since we have our 1,000 capacity sold out on the webinar, we are also live on AU Youth Envoy Facebook page. So share with your friends who can join us on Zoom, and we will take also a few questions from there. The webinar will be in English, but you can also ask your questions in Arabic and French. Le programme sera en anglais, mais vous pouvez poser vos questions aussi en français. سيكون البرنامج باللغة الإنجليزية، لكن يمكنكم طرح أسئلتكم باللغة العربية أيضاً. We will also be running polls throughout the webinar, so keep an eye, and when it pops up, make sure you participate. Thank you, Dr. Ngozi, for joining us. We're very excited to have you. And I just want to first ask, how are you doing? How are you coping with the pandemic and also the new added responsibilities to you?
Thank you, Aya. It's a delight to see you and also to be with all the young African people. I wish I could hug all of you. Thank you for asking. I'm caught in Washington, D.C. I was actually on my way to Abuja, but when the borders closed, I stayed here and I'm doing well. But I think I'm working even harder than before. I seem to be on Zoom conferences all day.
I can imagine. You're sought after right now, but we are very, very proud as young women to see you lead the international mobilization in this difficult time. And I know that I speak for many when I say we look up to you and we trust your leadership. So I want to dive straight into the topic. The pandemic is not only a health crisis, it's a human rights issue. It's an economic crisis that affects mostly young people because we're 60% of our populations. So before the pandemic, African economies generate only 3 million formal jobs for an estimated 12 million youth entering the workforce. And with the current situation now, we see 25 million, maybe an addition of unemployment. So really, what do we do for young people in the informal sector who are tremendously affected?
Well, thank you very much. I know that the pandemic has been a traumatic and unforeseen event in almost every part of the world. And it has been traumatic much, not only on the health side, like you said, Aya, but also on the economic side. In fact, it hit our continent first on the economic side, as we saw the demand for our products drop, and borders, as soon as borders closed in China and Europe and other places, we saw tourism dry up, remittances dry up. Then the pandemic arrived and we closed our own borders, and that was very hard. Actually, I say that for our policymakers, it was a tough and brave political situation because they all know that most of our people work in the informal sector. Some of them only earn on a daily basis. So lockdowns are very costly economically, but they are necessary, I think, to begin to let us know that, we have to behave differently. Now, as you said, unemployment for the youth has been a big problem on the continent, even before this time. Many countries, you have 25, 30% unemployment for our youth. Those who are employed, most of them are not in the formal sector, but the informal. So what does this mean, this pandemic? Well, they say that you should never waste a crisis. So we can choose to look at this crisis differently by saying, what are the opportunities that can come out of this crisis for young people? And I think those are some of the things I'd like to focus on, and maybe list 2 or 3 that we can talk about. First of all, for all the youth, you have seen that the pandemic has led to a lot of creativity in the technology space. Some people have invented, trackers for tracking the pandemic, which are being used in some countries. There are all sorts of apps and technology that are being deployed by our CDCs. I'm just using this as an example to show that even as we are in the midst of a crisis situation, youth have used it as a creative means to invent all sorts of things that can help us. So that's why I want to say to you, post-pandemic, or even during the pandemic, can we deploy the youth's minds to how to use technology in all the sectors of the economy to create different ways of doing business, to innovate? You're already doing it. I'm just saying, can you expand? Can you do more? Because the world is going digital. And that's what we need to do. You've seen this. We're all communicating through Zoom, having meetings with thousands of people. That's the way of the future. So I think technology is one clear area where we need you. We need to digitize in all sectors, digitize trade, digitize transport, digitize agriculture, payment systems and finance. We need to continue all these things. That's one clear area you can have an opportunity. Second, let me just mention in agriculture. This is one of the sectors where the continent has a comparative advantage. And we need young people to think about how we are going to feed ourselves. Many of you are in urban areas. There are not many young people in the farms. It's most of the farming population is older, and it's mostly, a lot of them are women. But we need to modernize agriculture. So how can you become an agricultural entrepreneur? By the way, I believe that young people shouldn't wait for anyone to create jobs for them anymore. They should create jobs for themselves and for other people. So what can you do in the agricultural space to modernize it? Let me say something. 40% of our harvest is wasted because we don't have post-harvest storage. Can some of you deploy your minds as to how we can store things better, have the technology adaptable that can do this? So those are two areas. Health systems. We're going to have to revamp the health systems on the continent completely. Is there a place for you? Because we need to strengthen this post-pandemic. So there are many other areas, but I just threw out three to start off the conversation.
Absolutely. So become a job creator, not just a job seeker. I think that's a clear message. Agriculture and technology. But the question comes here is that the digital divide. As you know, 70% of Africa is offline. And there is a big inequality on who has access to information, who has access to that technology, and who can digitalize. So for the youth who do not have that access, how can they get involved? How they can create these jobs for themselves and for other people?
Well, first of all, one of the most comforting things is that 40%, according to the statistics I saw, 40% of our youth have access or are on some kind of mobile system, that has access to the internet, even though some in the rural areas. But you're right. Of course, the majority do not have that access. And I think that this is where we need to step back, encourage the governments. I think many of them have seen the importance of digital, because the digital tracker that is being used in this pandemic is so useful. The fact that, we can get messages. I'm sitting here in the US, but I'm getting messages from Nigeria CDC every day telling me what to do. I think that's wonderful. So they've seen the value of that. We need to look at our economies, because one of the things that we still need to fix is infrastructure. And part of that infrastructure is laying the cables for the broadband, or trying to get cheaper means, some satellite means. And there are some tech giants that are willing to work with us on the continent and help us become more digital. So yes, we need to invest in the infrastructure.
Absolutely. It's a call to governments, but also to business leaders to really close this digital divide. So this question comes from the African Youth Front on Coronavirus, which the African Union launched last Wednesday as a high-level space for youth to influence policy and co-lead the response. And they're saying that it is estimated the continent needs about $100 billion US dollars to defend the healthcare system and counter the economic shock caused by the disease. So they're asking how Africa's economy will recover and how maybe the African Union see the necessity to deal with the debt burden and also accelerate CFTA, the Continental Free Trade Area.
Thank you very much. Let me tackle that from several approaches. Yes, the UNECA, UN Economic Commission for Africa, and the African finance ministers estimated that 100 billion will be needed to cope with the impact of this pandemic, not only on the health side, but economic side. The AU, African Union itself, has also estimated an additional 100 billion. So it's anywhere between 100 billion, 5% of our GDP, to 210%. And that depends a lot on how long this crisis is going to last. Initially, everybody thought that, well, after 6 months or so, 9 months, this will go away and we'll be able to start the recovery. But it's looking as if this may last a little bit longer, because also Africa is coming into it a little bit late. So in many of our countries, the curve is still climbing. Infections are doubling every 2 weeks from the statistics I can see. And we may not be flattening the curve yet. So we should prepare for a little bit of a difficult time. The second reason why we should prepare is because the forecasts for global economic growth are pretty grim. The IMF is forecasting a contraction for global growth of 3%. So if this is the case, it means also that those places to which we sell our goods may not be in good shape economically for demanding and paying for those goods. So it's going to be a bit of a tough time. And I think we need to look to ourselves inside and say, what can we do in order to help ourselves? And then what can we do to ask others to help us? So first, helping ourselves. I see that many countries on the continent have done some very good policies. Some of them have, central banks, for instance, have tried to give liquidity to the private sector and several sectors of the economy in order to shore them up. The governments have looked to see where they can trim and put extra resources towards priority expenditures in health, for instance, because you've got to live and be healthy first before you can even earn. At the same time, people are saying we don't want to die of hunger. Hunger virus will kill us. So the governments are also looking to see how can we distribute food to those who don't have it, and how can we all put some resources, direct transfers of cash into the hands of families who cannot work so they can buy food. So on many fronts they are trying. Some of them have decided not to ask for tax payments. They have waived tariffs on goods, all sorts of measures to try and make it work. So we are trying to help ourselves. The African Union has done well. It has opened a fund of $350 million to help Africa CDC and all the countries to procure equipment. As at now, the last time we met with the AU chief, we were told that $60 million has already been raised within the continent itself, with donations from countries that have contributed and also from our private sector. Mm-hmm. So the private sector philanthropy has been active. Mm-hmm. So that's the first part, help yourself. And I want to commend people on the continent also, because they have been practicing things that are quite difficult. Social distancing, staying in lockdowns, all very difficult, but that is one way we are helping ourselves. When all that is said and done, we still have a gap in terms of resources needed, if we look at those estimates. And therefore, that was why the AU said, let us appoint 5 envoys. And there are 5 of us. I'm not the only one. We have Dr. Donna Kaberuka, Mr. Trevor Manuel, Mr. Abdulrahman Ben Kalfa, and Mr. Tijan Tiam from all over the continent. And we are all working as a team to try to approach the external resources, external institutions, and all our friends outside to say, look, some of you want to help, let us see what you can do to mobilize resources. So far, things are going reasonably well. The IMF, for instance, has disbursed $11 billion to our countries. So they deal directly with the countries. We'll be talking to them, but when they want to send money, they deal with the countries directly. The IMF has also given debt relief to 19 African countries to a total of $198 million. The World Bank has disbursed about 14 billion, and they're all looking to do more. The African Development Bank, our own bank, has set aside 10 billion to deal with this problem. The Afro-Exim Bank, which is also our own bank, has set aside $3 billion to help the private sector to be able to help us procure equipment, help them with business and to survive. So those are just some numbers I wanted to share so that you see concretely things that happening. Then lastly, on the debt side, the envoys are also asking for a debt standstill, which means give us breathing room we're asking for 2 years. For 2 years, because we think this will last a little longer, so that instead of paying debt service now, we can use the money to buy supplies and equipment. We can use it to take care of our population at home. And the G20 has agreed to a bilateral debt standstill till the end of the year, but we think it's not enough, that they should go for another year, and they're willing to look at it. We're working with the private sector, private creditors, to try and get the standstill. Now, let me tell you, we're not saying we won't pay. We're just saying, give us breathing room, let us reschedule and reprofile the debt and pay it at a more reasonable pace. That will release almost 44 billion for us immediately in the pockets of the governments to be able to help the population. So let me stop there for a moment.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, I just wanted to follow up in helping ourselves. Another concern of youth constituency is that we see these many funds that have been pledged on continental, national, international for economic recovery and support. Also, South Africa announced, I think, a plan of 56 million to support small businesses. Cote d'Ivoire announced 200 million fund to boost economic activity. But the concern for youth is, are there mechanisms of accountability put in place to ensure the most vulnerable youth benefit actually from these funds?
Well, absolutely. I think that if we are, if governments are dispensing these monies, first our own monies, we have to be transparent and accountable, and that is one of the things that we're really talking about with governments. And then even more so, if you get money from outside, you have to be transparent so that those who are helping you know you're using it well. But here is where youth can be extremely active. You are the actors. Many of you have started budget tracking mechanisms, and civil society organizations are doing this. There are several of them all over the continent, and you can join in. Demand from your government to know what is being spent, what have they received for these monies, and how are they spending it. This can be published on the internet. It can be, and you can have access to it. So devise means to also monitor yourself. But I know in my own country, we have an organization called Budget, and they try to look at what the government is spending in the various ways. So there are other means of tracking government expenditures. And we are talking to African civil society. Right now, we had a meeting with them, the envoys met with civil society, 150 organizations, in order to see how can they too be active in helping us to track this money.
So, Your Excellency, this question comes from Tinashi. She says, a lot of young people have come up with amazing innovation, but along the way have been frustrated by leadership and bureaucracy. How best can we advocate for true inclusion and not just tokenism to address some of these structural barriers, especially when in some of our countries, holding people accountable might come with consequences?
That's a very, very, very important question. And there's no easy answer. I think that one of the things we are going to try to pass on, both to the African Union and our presidents, is the idea of being open. Some of them are already doing these things, are tracking their budgets, are publishing their budgets. So, but for those who are not, openness, concern, transmitting the concern of the youth to really know what is happening with monies, because the continent is yours. Aya said you're 60% of the population in almost every country. So we have to make sure that whatever we're doing as policymakers is transparent to you and you support it. So we will transmit that message and concern. We have to think of ways for those who have invented things to make them more public so that people will know that this kind of invention, and maybe venture capitalists, there we need to work with our own private sector. So I think that if you have invented something, don't just look at the government as a place in which you can get support, but see what venture capital within your own country, who are the big private sector people, who are those who are willing to invest. And please do that, because you may get more support from that side. If you also want to let Aya know, those of you who have very interesting inventions, let us know. And we also see how we can make this more public in different places. Thank you.
Absolutely, it's our role to amplify. So another question from Aki, she says, I believe the problem is not youth unemployment, but our education system, which is more knowledge-based than development of skills. Will the AU and government be improving our education system during COVID and post-COVID?
Thank you. The questions are really outstanding, I have to say. One of the things that has become so clear during this pandemic is that education can be done in a different way. So many places are teaching online, and there are a lot of resources online. In fact, there are universities who have put their whole curriculum online. Some of the Ivy League universities in the US, for instance, in the UK and other places. We also have our own universities. But what I'm trying to say is online education is going to be very important. And there again, Aya's point about who has access to internet, who doesn't have, is a big issue, because you can't really take advantage if you don't have access. So it goes back to trying to improve the basic infrastructure so we can change the way we do education. And yes, I do agree with you that in many cases, education is not very relevant to the times we're in. This is something we have to change. Starting from primary school, our young children have to start looking at technology and coding and so on totally differently, and learning it from the early stages, because this is the way the world is going to be. That means rethinking our education system. So I agree with you. This is no small job. And education is very emotional, very political. In many countries, students are very active, but we all have to step back and rethink our education so we can be relevant for the future.
Absolutely. So I have two last questions. The first one is from Moyo. She says, it's true that youth have to self-employ as part of solution to this crisis, but there are young people who are committed to serve in public service like myself. We look up to you for being dedicated and people who with ethical values like yourself, who have contributed so much in addressing Africa's socioeconomic challenges. But we face hostile, corrupt public environment, and myself have been victimized for whistleblowing. And I would just add to that, Your Excellency, that the average age of African leadership is 66 years old, and the average age of the population is 20 years old. So we have this 20 or more than 40 generation gap, and we don't see young people in public service and in leadership. And we see now the challenge that if we engage them, maybe now our institution would have been digitalized and would have responded to the crisis better. So maybe a message from you on youth in public service and those who are interested to be in public service.
Thank you so much. I know I said create jobs for yourself, and that's the way the majority have to go, but there are some who want to serve, and we need you. We need you in public service, and I know how hard it is. For the person who asked that question, you were victimized as a whistleblower. I also was in public service, and I had my moments and I suffered. I wrote a book about it, Fighting Corruption is Dangerous. Please go and read it. But that has not stopped me from wanting to serve, either in my country or for the continent. And I want to strongly encourage you. I know it's dangerous sometimes when you're whistleblowing, and we need to get better protections. That's one of the things I've been talking about. How do we devise a way to protect whistleblowers better on the continent? So that's one thing. But I want to strongly encourage public service, because if we don't do it, if you don't do it, there'll be a gap. And like Aya said, we need younger people in government. Let me tell you something. Nobody is going to hand over anything to you. You have to fight for it, and you have to wrest it. You know, it's like the women also, you know, young women. Nothing will be handed to you, by the way. You know, you say older people, no one is going to step aside and say, come. You have to fight for it. You fight for it through your votes, through your elections, through campaigning, through civil society activity. You have to get in there and fight for it. And I know it's dangerous sometimes, but it is worth it. So I want to encourage you, because we need young people. I myself, I'm totally energized when I'm around young people, because they have good ideas, they push you, they make you think differently, and that's what we need on the continent. Although old people, some of them are not, are also innovative and willing to do things differently. So don't consign all old people to the graveyard yet. But we need you young people as well.
Absolutely. We need co-leadership. We need your wisdom and our innovation. That's how we move Africa forward. So the last one is especially on the future, post-pandemic. So how do we get out of the crisis with transformation, transforming to renewable energy, to green economy, transitioning to a new economic model that works for our generation? And how can young people play a part in that?
Thank you, Aya. I'm really totally enjoying this, because the right questions are being asked. If recovering from this pandemic, if we get the resources that we need, or those we have gotten already, we cannot go back to business as usual. Let us try to do what they call building back better. So if we want to transform our economies, we want to build back, let us ask, what is the modern way of building back? And who should be involved in that building back? We must, for instance, put women at the center of decisions. I had a call from my older sister, Grasa Machel, the other day, saying, as envoys, you must be talking about women and gender. The same thing with youth. In the decisions about how to build back, if we don't get the right voices in, we might end up doing business as usual. So let's take example, infrastructure. You talked about building green. So if we are going to look to improve our electricity systems, our telecommunications, to lay broadband, are we going to do it the old way? No, we should look to solar. We should look to wind. We should look to all these things, so that as we move towards the future, we are in the renewable energy space. We also should move maybe gas as a transition, you know, but we know it's transition. We should really be moving to renewables. So that's one thing that we should look at. Logistics, you know, on the continent, not very good. As we try to rebuild our roads, our transport systems, our ports, are we doing that with the idea of a low carbon development path? Or are we doing it the old way? How do we rebuild with the modern climate change issues in mind, so we are contributors to a solution? Inclusion, I mentioned it. Let's include women, let's include youth. What types of economic policies are we going to support? We must be supporting sectors that can include people, those in our rural areas, those in our slums, those of our youth, to bring them back up into the economy. So I agree completely that we must think hard. What are those sectors where we can employ most of our people, especially our youth? Let us focus on that. I didn't even talk of creative industries. When we are building back, a lot of our youth are in design, in fashion, in architecture, in they are in art, they are in film, they are in theater. All these areas, are now the big areas we should support, because there are a lot of young people in those areas, and this can provide enormous numbers of jobs for them. So for me, including youth is looking for those sectors where youth are very active and trying to lay the infrastructure for those sectors, to support those sectors, to make resources available to the youth, to support them to become entrepreneurs.
Absolutely. And to conclude, I'd like to ask you, Dr. Ngozi, to give us one call to action to all the young people listening, more than 2,000 right now, and also one commitment from you as our new special envoy on COVID-19.
One call to action for all of you is, well, I have actually two. One is
Yes.
you want to be active in policy making and government. Vote. Use your voices. Be active. Become an activist to change things in your country. Don't just wait and look for government. You act to change things. So that's a call to action. Change government, vote, be an activist. Another call to action for you is create a job for yourself and create a job for 6 others. I'm not asking for 10. 1 job for yourself and 1 for 6. So 7 jobs per youth. And I think if you keep that in mind, that will change the lives of a lot of people. So 2 calls to action from me, and then commitment. My commitment is to continue pushing inside the continent and outside for additional resources to get us out, and to push for accountability and transparency in the use of those resources.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ngozi. We had the honor to have you today as our special guest, and you responded to a very challenging question, and I'm sure inspired action, not only to young people, but also to decision makers, business leaders, politicians, who need to show us some leadership in tackling youth and employment crisis. So you heard that young people fight for leadership, young women and young people, nothing will be handed over to us. We need to build back, vote, act, be an activist, create a job for yourself and for 6 more youth. And we are following your journey, Your Excellency, and we have total trust that you will get us out of this crisis with more sustainability. Thank you, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, for being with us today.
Thank you, Ayan. Thank you, everybody. Take care and keep safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So we had 2 polls that we have run. There is one coming up right now, which says, in your opinion, what are the economic challenges facing Africa most? You can choose job insecurity, health infrastructure, food insecurity, urban consumption and expenditure, or others. So please vote on that poll while we continue to conclude. I think the results of the previous polls as well show that this affirms African governments' expectation from us, and need to develop stimulus packages for young people during COVID-19 pandemic that would support those who lost their jobs and others whose income has been affected tremendously as a result of the pandemic. So we need to really find where youth are and make their space more resilient, make the market resilient to their needs. And this can be achieved through effective and accountable leadership, which is key to Africa's resilience and transformation. We come to the end of our webinar. Thank you all from across Africa and the world for joining us today, for asking questions. Many we couldn't get to, but I hope you had some answered. We need to continue the conversation, so please tweet us at Africa Youth Led, hashtag Africa Youth Led, and also continue to comment on the live webinar on Facebook. We will continue engaging and advocating on this particular topic because it's one of the top priorities of African youth and the youth agenda at large. Young people, let us continue to organize, unite, play our part to lead and co-lead the solution with our leaders. We are the ones to save our continent. So thank you again for joining, and see you next Wednesday. Salam.